Welcome back, and this is the final lesson on quantity in English. And we're going to look at a few and a little. Just like the last two lessons, we're going to check if a few and a little work with countables and uncountables, and also in positive, question, and negative sentences. We'll also look at the difference between a few and a little and little. So here is the table that we're going to complete during this lesson. As you can see, we have a few and a little, and we have boxes to see if they work with countables or uncountables, and boxes to see if they work with positive statements, questions, and negatives. So let's start with a few. And the first question is, does it work with countables or uncountables? For example, can we say a few apples? Apples being countable plural. And the answer is, yes, we can. A few is fine with countable plurals. How about a few bread? Bread being uncountable. Does this work? And the answer is, no, it doesn't. Uncountable does not work with a few. So, a few works with countable plurals, a few apples only. Let's now look at a little. Does this work with countables or uncountables? For example, can we say a little apples in the countable plural? And the answer is, no, we can't. A little does not work with countable plural. How about a little bread with the uncountable being bread? Does this work? And the answer is, yes, it does. A little is fine with uncountables. So, a little works with uncountables only. So, a few for countable plurals, a few apples, and a little for uncountables, a little bread. Let's now look at how a few and a little work with positive, question, and negative sentences. Starting with a few, let's have a look at 3 example sentences in the positive, the question, and the negative. First sentence, I've bought a few apples. Does this work in the positive? And the answer is, yes, it does. A few is fine with positive statements. How about in the question? Can we say, would you like a few apples? Does this work? The answer is, yes, it does. A few is fine with question sentences. And finally, in the negative, can we say, I don't have a few apples? And the answer is, no, it doesn't. A few does not work with negatives. Instead of few here, we would use any or many. So, I don't have any apples, or I don't have many apples. Let's complete our table for a few. So, in the positive statement, a few is fine. It's also correct with questions, but in negatives, a few does not work. Instead, we should use any or many. So that's a few. Let's now turn to a little. Does this work with positive, question, and negative sentences? 3 more sentences. The first in the positive, I've bought a little bread. Does this work? And the answer is, yes, it does. A little is fine with the positive. Next, in the question, can we say, would you like a little bread? And the answer is, yes, we can. A little is fine with questions. And finally, can we use a little with negatives? For example, I don't have a little bread. And the answer is, no, we can't. In the negative, instead of a little, we should use any or much. So let's now finalize our table. A little with positive statements is fine. It's also fine in questions, but it doesn't work in negatives. Instead, we should use any or much. So, one final summary. We use a few with countable plurals, a few apples, and we use a little with uncountables, so a little bread. We can use a few and a little in the positive and in question sentences. We can use neither a few, a little in negatives. In the negative, instead of a few, we should use any or many, and instead of a little, we should use any or much. Now, before we finish, I want to say something about few and little, as opposed to a few and a little. Now, for a few and few, let's have some example sentences. First one, there are a few nice pubs in this area, and there are few nice pubs in this area. Obviously, there is an "a" missing in the second sentence, but what's the difference in meaning? Well, when we say a few nice pubs, we are talking about 3 or 4 pubs, so it's a positive sentence. Whereas if we say few nice pubs without "a," the meaning is not many pubs, so it's a negative sentence. Let's have a look at a little and little. I have a little time if you need me, and I'm afraid I have little time. What's the difference in meaning? Well, in the first sentence, a little, we are talking about some time or a small amount of time. It's a positive sentence. Whereas if I say, I'm afraid I have little time, the meaning is I have not much time. So it's a negative sentence. So, to summarize, when we say few and little, few means not many and little means not much. So that's the end of our lesson. Here is the PDF for you to download, and as you can see, it has some example sentences to help. There is also a note about few and little, which we've just talked about. So that's the end of the section on quantity in English. Join me now for the practice exercises, which are on all types of quantity that we've looked at. So, some, any, many, much and a lot of, and a few and a little.